this is the third, I think, lecture series that started with Whatever Happened. In fact, this is the 13th series of this Wednesday lectures. The previous ones were called Whatever Happened to Reconciliation, which was a good title because 3 weeks later, 3 weeks after the start of the lecture series, there was the intervention in Northern Territory. And another one was Whatever Happened to Argument, whose theme is connected actually to the theme of this new series. 3 things made me think of the title of this lecture series. The first was something that's in the advertising for this lecture, which is that a week or so before the last election, Joe Hockney said in, I thought, a rather disdainful way, that he couldn't understand why people were so impatient or so needy of the costings for the prospective budget, even though he had every good reason at that stage to think that he would be the next treasurer. And so when I heard him say this, I thought, whatever happened to democracy, partly out of a sort of sense of lamentation that things have come to its pass, but also a kind of ironic ad hominem, as it were, against the party that had so relentlessly attacked its opposition, especially the Green, for having authoritarian sort of dispositions and for hiding things and not being straight and so on. And that's all in the name of democratic, respectful democratic institutions. And the irony, my sense of the irony, was deepened in large part afterwards, because after all the emphasis placed on freedom of expression and freedom of opinion by the same party, we were denied all sorts of important information which would make our opinions informed opinions, and not about relatively trivial matters, but about matters that would affect anybody who had a serious concern for this country. And again, the kind of irony, it was the denial of information, let's say, about what was happening on the high seas with asylum seekers, and later information about the places in which they were incarcerated, was defended on the grounds that, on rather jingoistic expressions of the need to protect national sovereignty. And of course, everybody knows that the concept of national, that sovereignty isn't an issue, whatever asylum seekers might threaten. It's not our sovereignty as a nation. And the insistence on describing it as an issue about sovereignty, and then the various military notions that went with that, ensured that debate about this entered a kind of cloud cuckoo land in which it was impossible really to have a serious discussion, and in which it became impossible actually, because the jingoistic undertone of this, to say that one of the reasons we needed information about this sort of thing was because it was the information that anybody who loved this country needed, so that their love would be a truth and elusive. And of course, after that, there followed all sorts of authoritarian sort of strictures on various kinds of institutions, not the least of which was the ABC, strictures that undermined again the conditions of being informed citizens. So it appears that this government believes that just as we have the right to be bigots, so it has the right to deny us the kind of information that gives dignity to the notion of freedom of speech. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what gives that idea a certain nobility and dignity. But when I actually went to vote in that election, a woman came up to me and handed me a half a vote card and said, "Will you vote for my son, who's a member of the coalition?" And I said to her that even if I agreed with everything, with all the policies of the coalition, I wouldn't vote for it because of the disdain that Joe Hocking had shown for democracy in showing the disdain for our need to be informed about budget, which is such an important feature of their electoral policy. And you won't be surprised, or some of you won't be surprised to know that I don't agree with all the policies of the coalition. Criticising the substantive policies of the coalition is not my object tonight at all. I want to criticise only those aspects of the government policy that bear on this thing, what happened to democracy. And I think it's true to say that these criticisms are in fact consistent with someone who was quite, in other respects, with policy respects, quite a serious supporter of the coalition. Now, dear friend Martin Krieger, who gave the Boyer lecture some years ago, said in those lectures that in politics it's always important, of fundamental importance indeed, to ask compared to what. And I think he's right. So when I ask what's happened to democracy, I don't wish to add all, not in the slightest, to underplay the importance of the fact that in many ways, including politically, Australia is rightly regarded by many people, especially many immigrants and people who want to come here, as a political paradise. And as a person, as an immigrant to this country, I was only 4 at the time, but I remember, it goes deep with me actually, the memory of what was said to me by a man who helped raise me, about whom I've written in Romulus, my father. His name was Panteleimon Hora, and he was a refugee from the tyrannies of communism in Romania. And he was, like many migrants, came to was sent to Bonegilla, a migrant reception centre in the north of the state, and was later moved to a camp in central Victoria where he worked on the Rotten River. But he told me the story that on the way to central Victoria, he stopped overnight in Melbourne, and he wandered through the city for quite some time, and he was constantly incredulous, joyfully incredulous actually, but nonetheless incredulous, that nobody stopped and asked him for his papers. Many years later, he went to Romania to visit his brother, and he told him that nobody in all those years had ever asked to see his papers. And his brother said, well, what kind of country is this? How is it possible that nobody asked ever to see your papers? And as I say, this is something that really goes deep with me, and it really matters that this is a country in which we don't have to carry identity papers, in which none of us has to fear that we'll be woken up in the middle of the night and dragged off because of what we've said, and that we all know and can be confident that there'll be an election in which we can express our opinion about how this government has performed, and that it won't be a rigged election, and nobody will be intimidated, and so on. You might think that these kinds of things that I'm enumerating, as it were, features of our paradise, are pretty elementary. They might be, someone might say, they're just the kinds of things that people would say in support of the idea that democracy is a pretty rotten form of government, but it's the best that we've got. Now, I don't think so, but I am prepared to say with Martin that whatever we think of what's happened to democratic institutions in this country, we always have to ask when we make our judgment compared to what. And I have myself to confess that the ideals often expressed, but especially were expressed in my student days, of participatory democracy, seems to me very onerous and burdensome, and it can't involve in political processes that I never have wanted. So, nonetheless, on one hand, though these seem elementary things and so on, and they seem robust, I oscillate between a sense of their robustness and a sense of their fragility. After all, most of the peoples of the earth have never enjoyed such political privileges, not in the past and not now. Well, I said there are three things that prompted me to think about this lecture series as having to do with democracy. And the second is that long before George Brandes was talking about this, I was really worried about the consequences of people coming back to this country from Syria and Iraq. And indeed, partly because, it might seem paradoxical at first, but I think partly because this is such a wonderful paradise that in itself enrages them. And in part because these young men, I'm sure having seen the most terrible bloodshed where they've been, think, why on earth should these people, why should they be so privileged, so comfortable? And they will, I imagine, offer justifications for that sense of outrage, which connect with things we've done or failed to have done. In the case of Iraq, with our involvement, when we were members of a coalition of the willing, let's say, perhaps also now because of Gaza. But what worried, so I think Brandes is absolutely justified in saying we have a lot to fear. And I think not just in the relatively immediate future, as some of these young men come back, but in the longer term for reasons that I'll explain later. But while I'm concerned about that, I'm also concerned, as many people are, about what we will do to protect ourselves against those dangers. And as I'll say later, we've been here before when we were, many of us were troubled about what was being proposed and sometimes what was actually being done when we were fearful of terrorists. So, the third thing is, that made me think about this is my pessimism about the will of the nations of this earth to do what's necessary to avoid what can only, I think, soberly be described as the catastrophic consequences that are likely to follow as a result of climate change. And what will happen when they are panicked, these nations are panicked, into taking perhaps draconian measures to avoid that, or at least to ameliorate that catastrophe, crushing resistance to it. On that pessimism about our political will, Robert Mann has spoken in this series of lectures, and so has Clive Hamilton. Well, what makes it possible for a government that is so emphatically insistent upon the right to free speech? What makes it possible for it to be so disdainful about what makes that free speech politically important, namely information? Well, I think it's partly because of the cultural wars. George Brandes and Christopher Pyne and Tony Abbott are clearly old cultural warriors. And indeed, as Guy Russell pointed out in an article in Crikey, cultural warriors, and in this respect, very different from John Howard, whose battles were really set in their student days at university. As Guy said, it's like being governed now, actually, by a whole bunch of student politicians, like also both being a right-wing takeover, student representative kind of thing. But of course there are more serious reasons than that, and a lot of them are reasons that are best explored by political theorists and historians and social theorists of one kind or another. But what interests me, and the only thing on which I have any kind of competence anyhow to talk, because I'm a philosopher, is a characterization of what I might call the conceptual space in which we think about our political responsibilities and privileges, and what a demarcation of that conceptual space might show about what concepts we've either lost or have a very fragile hold upon. And my hope in this lecture is to sketch a conceptual space in which we can articulate fully the ethically complex nature of citizenship, and thereby to reclaim the dignity of the political realm. In fact, to enable us to speak again of political dignity without even suspecting that might be an oxymoron. Max Weber, as some of you I'm sure will know, called his classical essay, in which he outlined the ethical complexity of political responsibility, he called that essay Politics as a Vocation. And that he could think of politics as a vocation is, I think, essential to understanding the kind of tension that he characterized as existing between what he called, on the one hand, ethics of absolute ends, and on the other hand, an ethic of responsibility. And some of you may have heard me speak, I spoke some years ago in this very lecture, of the consequences for an understanding of academic life and loss of concept of vocation, and consequences for what we can seriously make, or what depth we can give to the idea of intrinsic value, whether we can seriously talk without rhetoric and an easy desire to edify, of the love of truth, what we can make of collegiality and so on. And I think our understanding of these things has been transformed by the loss of a serious concept of an academic vocation. Whether for good or for ill, that's another matter. And what I, in fact, have suggested about the consequences of the loss of the concept of vocation to the academic form of life, I'd say in many ways analogously about the consequences for our political life of the loss of that concept. The consequences for our thoughts about citizenship, love of country, freedom of speech, and interdependently with all that, the dignity of the political realm. But I wouldn't want you to think at all that I blame the Abbott government for what I take to be here a conceptual loss, and I think indeed a kind of degradation of discourse. Such loss comes slowly upon us, and we often discover it quite unawares, so it goes historically rather deep. And if I continue the analogy just a little bit with universities, I can illustrate this in what for me was a rather dramatic occasion when I realized that a certain concept of the university had been lost to us. And that was in the early 1980s in Leeds, and it was a couple of years into Margaret Thatcher's government, and a philosophy department, had been closed in southern England, and the philosophers gathered together at the University of Leeds to see what they could do to protect their discipline. And I was sent along as a departmental representative from King's College. The meeting was opened by the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds, and he spoke rather movingly. He said even in those early days that the universities had been under, people like him, had been under great pressure and had sometimes made decisions and indeed compromised for pragmatic reasons when they shouldn't have done so. And then he said, and I remember these words because he spoke them with such intensity and such sincerity, and he said, remember this was a meeting of philosophers, he said, but surely philosophy won't offer an extrinsic justification for itself. Well, the philosophers offered every extrinsic justification they could possibly think of. But to a Minister of Education who was present, they kept insisting that you couldn't have anything justifiably called a university if it didn't also have a philosophy department. And they said this many, many times, and eventually the minister got irritated and said, all right then, we can't call it a university, we'll call it something else then. And the philosophers didn't know what to say. Really, they didn't know what to say. And this really was like a moment when the emperor has no clothes. We hadn't realised that the concept had gone defunct, that it was no longer true, that nobody knew seriously anymore how to go on after you'd said things. And the same might probably have been said at that time if someone had said you can't have a university without a humanities department. These were regarded as kinds of quasi-conceptual truths, truths that you could realise after a certain amount of reflection, perhaps historically informed reflection, about the nature of the concept. But just as and in fact the two things went together, the loss of the idea of a university, it seemed to me, or of a particular concept of the universities that would sustain those kinds of tautologies and perhaps nourish any elaboration of them. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, a substantive idea of intrinsic value. And it was because of that loss, I think, that the philosophers themselves had little confidence in elaborating a serious concept of intrinsic value in response to the Vice-Chancellor's request, and which is why they fell back constantly on saying things like, well, you can't have education without the philosophy of education, you can't have physics without, etc., etc., as though philosophy were essentially a service subject to other disciplines. And one of them even went so far as to say, you can't have democracy without philosophy, without philosophy departments, because who's there to teach you how to think properly? No wonder the minister got irritated. Well, anyway, so just as Margaret Thatcher didn't cause that conceptual loss, and indeed, I believe, in connection to the idea of intrinsic value, it's been with us for centuries, ever since John Stuart Mill found nothing better to say about this kind of thing than that it was a higher pleasure. But just as Margaret Thatcher was not responsible for that conceptual loss, so Tony Abbott and his ministers are not responsible for whatever conceptual loss we've suffered with respect to our capacity seriously to articulate an idea of citizenship that has real nobility. Well, nonetheless, having said that, it is true that they've quite zealously contributed to the degradation of political discourse by a kind of unrelenting reference to what is owed to us and what we owe one another and to the government as taxpayers, ignoring other important dimensions of citizenship that are relevant to the context in which they talk about our responsibilities as taxpayers, for example. It's as though the political description taxpayer is the one that is now the preeminent one under which to identify what the government owes to us and what we owe to it. But that, I think, even that has been the expression of a long-standing displacement of a serious talk of government as governing, as opposed to government as running the country for the benefit of an economy. And the extent to which that is so, I think, can be gauged by the fact that in the last presidential elections in the United States, when Romney kept insisting that his qualifications for the presidency lay essentially in the fact that he had so successfully managed many businesses, not once did it occur to Obama to ask him why he thought that having been a successful business person was at all a qualification for becoming President of the United States, even if the economy is the main thing at issue, even if it is. Because governing a nation and being responsible for its economy is quite different from running a business or running any kind of enterprise. And so the fact that it never occurred to Obama to make what would have struck me as a pretty obvious and very serious point that might have left Romney as speechless as the philosophers were when the minister expressed his irritation, just shows how pervasive is this way of speaking about the nature of our political responsibilities. And that, in fact, might provide a locus for understanding what would otherwise be, and I've been almost implying it is, thought to be a kind of paradox, that we have a government that is zealous about the need of freedom of speech, but equally sometimes zealous in denying us the information we need to express that freedom responsibly. And the answer lies essentially in the fact that we don't have political rights of any kind simply by virtue of the fact that we're human beings, even though it's true that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares freedom of speech to be a human right which we possess merely by virtue of being human beings. But the concept of a human being in that declaration is already an politically inflected notion. We're not talking about the species Homo sapiens, but about a certain kind of community constituted in this case as a community of nations by virtue of the fact that we all have political personas of one kind or another. And it's an ethical inflection, but as I say, essentially a political one. So just as academic freedom, for example, to go back to my analogy, depends upon one's conception of one's identity in the academy as an academic, and not as a human being who has the right to say this or that. And so one's identity, political identity, important to the category of free speech is not that one's a human being, or certainly not that one is a member of the species Homo sapiens, but that one is what is now, I mean, the category mostly is citizenship, that one's a citizen, or something conceptually derivative of that. So, and there's no such thing at the moment, and I hope there never will be such a thing, as merely being a citizen of the world. But there is such a thing as belonging to a community of nations by virtue of being a citizen of a particular nation, answerable to international law, especially to international criminal law. And what you make of that fact of being a community of nations answerable to laws that make that community what it is, what you make of the rights that are conferred by citizenship will be different if you have a serious conception of the dignity of the political realm and the concepts that go to make up for that, than if you don't, if you simply think of governing as running a country more or less as you would run an enterprise. I might say, just on this notion of the nobility of free speech, especially since George Brandes has declared himself to be essentially a follower of John Stuart Mill on this. Mill thought it was essentially the dignity of political discussion, and he thought of discussion as seriously conducted only if the participants in that discussion, if they were disagreeing about something,
were open to persuasion about the matter under dispute. And of course, like everybody else, he knows that often you would think it extremely unlikely that you would be persuaded by some of the things your fellow citizens would say. But he thought the only remedy against bigotry, actually, was to be open to the possibility that you might be in that way persuaded. And he hoped through that kind of discussion, truth would eventually be discovered. Now, David Irving has been recently in the news again. He, I'm sure you'll know, is a historian, a British historian who's a Holocaust denier. And he's been in the news partly because there's been, there have been people in Europe, in parts of Europe where Holocaust denial is a criminal offence, who've been denying the Holocaust. Recently, in part, it's a consequence of the Israeli invasion of Gaza. And one of the interesting things about Irving was that, and these other Holocaust deniers, but it's particularly interesting about Irving because he is, in other respects, a quite, I gather, distinguished historian. Anyway, he's an historian. He's not a kind of ignorant thug. Is that when people insist, and I think rightly insist, that he should have the right to speak on a platform and to express why he, sorry, I was going to express the reason, but that's more complicated. Let's just say express his Holocaust denialism. They often say it's only in that way that he will be exposed. And of course that presupposes the idea that there could be something like a serious argument there, that someone could go and argue with Irving in front of an audience who might be open to the possibility, however unlikely it might be, that Irving is right. But I know of nobody who was ever engaged in discussion with Irving on the assumption, however unlikely it might be, he might turn out to be right. And the reason is, I think, because the people who have actually engaged him in discussion, in inverted commas, on public platforms, know that in order to believe what Irving believes, you have either to be a crank or an anti-Semite. And that isn't included in Mill's constituency of political discussion and free speech. And this is in fact an interesting and general point about racism, which is that racists are not motivated in what they say and what they do by the stereotypes that they express about the victims of their denigration. And this has been a long finding about racism ever since the 1950s, when there was a lot of interest in it because of the Holocaust. These are rationalizations in the pejorative sense of that expression. That is, it's not that they believe these things and they motivate them. They're motivated by things altogether different. And therefore, they can't really be, to understand them, is not to think of them as mistaken about some matter, which if only we had enough time and only we had enough patience, we might convince them of the error of their ways. That's not the case at all. And the reason this matters, I think, is, if I'm not mistaken, George Brandes made a point of saying that one ought to be free to express what he acknowledged to be bigoted views and views that others might think to be racist, if it was in the context of something like an argument or a discussion. But my point is that the concept of discussion lapses in the case of racism. That doesn't mean that racists should be prevented. Of itself, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be allowed to say what they want to say. But you can't defend it by some ideal which is predicated on the idea of discussion, revealing mistakes, showing someone that the errors of their ways, and so on. Well, I said a moment ago that that the inflection in the concept of humanity as it's used in the Declaration of Human Rights was a political inflection. An ethical inflection, but a political one. And some of you might be puzzled as to why I put it that way. The reason is that I think of the ethical as being a domain of value, a domain in which we think about how we should live, which includes morality, law, and politics as quite distinctive realms of value, with different conceptions of responsibility attached to them, distinctive but interdependent. And I'll try to explain why I say that and what it means and what implications it has by taking law as my example. And I'll do it, the example I'm taking is because, as many of you will know, after September 11th, many academics, and well, not many, but quite a few academics and politicians and lawyers argued that there are certain circumstances in which we should relax the absolute prohibition against torture, especially if it would save many, perhaps as September 11th showed, possibly thousands of lives. And one of the people who initiated this debate was Alan Dershowitz, who's an academic lawyer at Harvard, became most famous initially for defending O.J. Simpson, and got him off his murder charge. And a legal academic called Jeremy Waldron wrote what I think is a very fine paper in the Columbia Law Review, in which he expressed his distress and indeed shame that members of the legal profession were defending the right sometimes to torture people or attacking the absolute prohibition as it exists in international law against torture. And this is what he has to say. He says, I quote, "It's dispiriting as well as shameful to have to turn our attention to this issue. I want to place particular emphasis on the fact that these efforts to modify the prohibition on torture are undertaken by lawyers. Sure, our primary objection to torture ought to be articulated in regard to the immediate situation of those who are going to suffer the treatment that Dershowitz, he's the person I mentioned, Bybee and you were White House lawyers advising George W. Bush at the time, that Dershowitz, Bybee and you appear to condone. But the defense of torture is also shocking as a jurisprudential matter. That views and proposals like these should be voiced by scholars who have devoted their lives to law, to the study of the rule of law, and to the education of future generations of lawyers is a matter of dishonour for our profession. Reading the memoranda of Judge Bybee and Professor Yu and the mooted proposals by Professor Dershowitz shook my faith in the integrity of the community of American jurors. Well, Waldron said he was ashamed of the dishonour that these people had brought on American jurisprudence because they had proposed something which is entirely contrary to the spirit of what he called our form of law. He didn't quite say what reach that our had, but our form of law. It's rather important because he wasn't suggesting that this might be, as it were, the Platonic essence of law. He said our form of law. And I quote him again, "Law," he writes, expressing not here a statement of fact, but what he believes is fundamental to our form of law, this is what he says, is not brutal in its operation. Law is not savage. Law does not rule through abject fear and terror, or by breaking the will of those whom it confronts. If law is forceful or coercive, it gets its way by methods which respect rather than mutilate the dignity and agency of those who are its subjects." End of quote. Well, Waldron believes that breaking the will of a person by torture is always morally terrible. But if I understand him, he believes that the jurors he criticised had dishonoured not only morality, but also the law as the expressive of a value sui generis. For him, the law against torture has an inexpugnable moral dimension, to be sure, but it's not exhausted. Its ethical dimensions are not exhausted by that moral dimension or by that dimension together with other more practical concerns that could be described without reference to the fact or without reference to irreducibly legal concepts. Someone who thought that torture could be justified morally, and now I'm trying to express the distinctions here, or the complex relations between morality, law, and politics. Someone who thought that torture could be justified morally might nonetheless oppose it becoming lawful, not because of the prudential reasons for which such a stand is very often taken, and the bad consequences that might ensure were it to become lawful. No, such a person might oppose it because she believes, as Waldron does, that torture is an offence against the essential nature and dignity of law as we have it. And a politician might believe, without inconsistency, that torture can never be morally justified, and that it is an offence against the spirit of law, but that nonetheless, in certain circumstances, must be done, not only to protect lives, but to protect the very conditions of political communality. And torn between incommensurable imperatives, the imperatives of law and the imperatives of morality and the imperatives of politics, she might say that if she's to be true to the responsibilities of her vocation as a politician, she must sometimes do what morally she must do, what must not do, what legally she must not do. And I think it's essential to understanding Weber's distinction between an ethics of responsibility and an ethics of absolute ends, that he doesn't see these as just two moral conceptions, that the conflict is a conflict within morality. I think he thinks of a conflict within the realm of the ethical between morality and a distinctive responsibility which he assigns to politics. And I think if one thinks that the conflicting imperatives must, if one thinks this is a kind of conceptual must, be moral imperatives if they're to lay a claim on a morally serious person, if one thinks that must be the case because that's the nature of morality, I think that one is then in the grip of a moralistically distorted conception of the nature of morality. And at least since the time of Plato, Western political thought has been haunted by the belief or the fear that morality and politics may be in deep and irreconcilable conflict. Not, I really want to emphasise, because politics is something too disreputable for a morally good person to take part in, but because at critical points, moral and political conduct belong to incommensurable realms of value, both of which will claim the allegiance of any serious person. Now, let me make a point here about the concept of vocation. Just as I think one can't, from, let's say, the concept of a profession, let alone the concept of a career, derive in academic life anything that looks like a serious requirement, an obligation to a love of truth. I mean, the concept of a profession won't yield such a thing. So it seems to me the concept of a profession or a career can't yield to a politician that conception of what she was required to do by virtue of her political vocation. One of the things that distinguishes, I think, the concept of a vocation from the concept of a career is the historical depth of a concept of a vocation. Thinking of a vocation to politics or a vocation to, let's say, to medicine or to healing or to the academic line, it makes sense to say, even if when one says it, it's false, but it makes sense to say, the concept allows one to say that an entire age has lost an understanding of what it means really to heal, to care, or what it means to have an academic vocation, of what it means most seriously to exercise political responsibility. But generally that can't be said of the idea of a profession, even though that's something sometimes disguised from us, because so many professions have also been, and to the extent that the concept is available to us at all, still are vocations. Well, we've been before where Waldron lamented we were when he wrote that paper, and at more or less the same time when we were discussing responses to terrorism here in Australia. And I remember a moment when the then Attorney General Philip Ruddock came back from a trip to America and said that he had been examining his obligations under Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everybody has a right to life, liberty and security of person. And he said at that time he didn't want to be the Attorney General, the first Attorney General against whom grieving relatives could complain that he had done not enough in order to protect the lives of Australian citizens. And this morning I heard on the radio in the airport lounge, I heard Josh Frydenberg echoing something like this when, in response to journalists who are anxious about what might be in store for us now about the concern for the security of Australian lives because of the possibility of terrorism. He said, well, look, you just imagine what you would feel the next day after a terrorist attack when you saw the dead people and so on. And the idea here is that the overriding responsibility, and in fact, Ruddock declared it to be the only absolute responsibility, was the protection of human life. Well, it is, of course, the fundamental duty of politicians to try to protect the lives of their citizens, but it's also a fundamental responsibility of politicians to protect the institutions that define the political identity of their nation, of citizenship, institutions they may cherish, the rule of law, the right not to have to prove yourself innocent, for example, in a criminal court, the right to a fair trial, free speech, and so on. And to protect such institutions, politicians have sent hundreds of thousands of citizens to their death in battle, and usually because their citizens, and usually anyway, not because, but usually their citizens have consented. And confronted last century with the politically motivated mass murder by the right and the left, and by genocide in the heart of Europe, in Asia and in Africa, in Central America, in Guatemala, for example, no one who was even moderately politically informed could have failed to realise how important it is for states to safeguard the lives of their citizens. Yet that often very bitter realisation prompted no one then seriously to propose publicly that torture should be one of the means with which to do it. To the contrary, in that same blood-soaked century, we saw the development of international law, which included the prohibition of torture without exception whatsoever. Now, could anyone seriously believe that those who drafted that convention against torture did not anticipate that compliance with it would almost certainly at some stage cost lives, to be lost. To believe that they didn't realise that, you'd have to think they're complete political dilettantes. Like many others I've pointed out in the past, the terrorists threaten only our lives. And to save our lives, governments have threatened some of the deepest of our political values. Some citizens consented to this, others protested that in what was called the War on Terror, they're prepared to die for those values. I remember a very dear friend of mine once, who's now dead, proposed at the time when there were hijackings, first of all in the 1970s, I think it was, of airlines. And he, agreeing with those who said you can't possibly give in to the demands of the hijackers, he said what we should do is make clear to our governments that we take it now as a kind of responsibility of being a citizen in this kind of country. We become, as it were, voluntary conscripts. And say, letting it be clear that we don't want the government to negotiate for our lives. Citizens can consent to this. And in the case of torture, a person might think that rather than be part of a nation that is prepared to torture only for the sake of saving lives, that person would rather die and invite fellow citizens to join in this rather different coalition of the willing. And the other conceptual point that needs to be made here is that someone might think the preparedness to do that, the refusal to agree to torture for the sake of saving lives, is not a constraint on the national interest. It's not something that's put in the way of serving the national interest or the common good. They might think to the contrary that this is part of an enriched conception of the common good, that we not be such a nation, that we be able, as a condition of being able, as surely citizens who love their country want to be able to love their country truthfully and without shame. And that, as I say, would be in this case an enriched conception of the common good. But sometimes there are circumstances in which terrorist attacks threaten not only the lives of a nation's citizens, but also the conditions of their civic life. And writing many years ago in The Guardian, the Israeli novelist David Grossman described the effect of constant suicide bombings on communal life in Israel. And this is a quote. Just a few weeks of life in the shadow of terror will show every nation that believes itself enlightened just how rapidly and sharply it can turn needs into values. Lets fear determine its norms. Terror humiliates. It rapidly returns a human being into a pre-cultural, violent and chaotic existence. It determines where a society's breaking point is. It entices certain groups, not small ones, to join it and to actively seek to use force to destroy and crush everything they hate. Terror contains something that acts like a decomposition enzyme, the decomposition of the private human body and the public body. A country that fights terror fights not only for the physical security of its citizens, it also fights for their reason to live, for their humanity, for everything that makes them human and civilized. Well, at issue here, as Grossman sees it, is not the lives, the physical lives of citizens, but the very conditions of political life. And for the defence of such conditions, for community, politicians will always do morally terrible things if they judge it to be necessary. And most people know that, and most people expect it of them, under pain of irresponsibility. And as I said before, sometimes torn between incommensurable imperatives, one political, the other moral, politicians must sometimes do what morally they must not do. But I think it should be absolutely clear when we think in the coming months about our situation in relation to the possibility of terror attacks that we're a very, very long way from a situation like that. I'll just say very quickly a couple of words about climate change. It seems to me that the scientific consensus on climate change is now such that one must accept that it's reasonable to believe, at least one must accept that, it's reasonable to believe, even if one does not oneself believe, that the effects of climate change will very soon be ruinous for life on Earth and will create political instability and upheavals. And the risks are greater, obviously, in poorer nations, which are victims of circumstances caused in large part by wealthy nations. And almost certainly such upheavals will be the occasion for an increase in war crimes and crimes against humanity. The wealthy, mostly Western democratic nations will be likely driven to authoritarian measures to deal with the dramatic effects of climate change as they become rationally incontestable, but are nonetheless downplayed by some who have interests in doing that. What can protect us against that kind of authoritarianism, which I think is such a deep possibility in the politics of climate change? Well, someone might say we'll have constantly to fall back on some serious idea of human rights. And I think that might be true. But it's very important, I think, to realise that the concept of a human right, even if one believes in inalienable human rights, depends very much on elaboration in other contexts to reveal its ethical significance. There's a wonderful passage in an essay by Simone Weil, and the essay is called Human Personality, in which she's rather critical of, she's in fact critical of the notion of rights full stop, but certainly critical of the significance we attach to it. And she says something like this in that essay. She says, look, if we see a farmer who's haggling about the price of his eggs at the market, he can say, look, I have the right to sell my eggs for whatever price I like. She goes on to say, but if a young girl's being dragged into a brothel, she's not going to start talking about her rights. The reason, Weil says, is not because, as a matter of fact, it would be ineffective in such a situation to start claiming your rights. The reason is that the deeper reason is that the concept of a right can't elaborate the terrible wrong that is done to her, the terrible nature of the wrong done to her. And this would come out very readily, I think you can see it, if you try to imagine the person dragging her there later to be remorseful. And if you were to say something like, my God, what have I done? I've violated her human rights, her inalienable human rights. That won't take one to an understanding of the terribleness of what that girl has suffered, the moral terribleness of what that girl has suffered. Well, Weil is in this case concerned with the moral terribleness of the violation of the right. But the concept of a right is also, I mean, the violation of a right is characteristically also a crime, not just a moral offence against the individual whose right has been violated, but an offence against the legal community whose laws have been broken. And the difference here can easily be seen in the fact that in the moral case, if the person asks for forgiveness, the victim can give it, and indeed gives it as one person, one human being to another. In the case of a crime, when the law says you may forgive, but we're going to prosecute, the person is charged not as a human being, but as a citizen, or at any rate, someone under some political designation. And that's one of the big differences, it seems, between the concept of a moral offence against an individual human being and the idea of a crime. So what I want to say, and this connects now, I go back to what I was saying earlier, it seems to me if we are when we're in danger of that disposition to authoritarian politics, just because the consequence of not being authoritarian is so great. If we go back to rely on something like the notion of human rights or other prescriptions in what we have available to us in international law, we're going to make sure that we have a much richer understanding of the ethical complexity of political action than is now available to us in our ordinary political discourse. A much richer conception of the complex relations between ethics, politics and law, none of which, I keep emphasising, will be given to us if we keep talking only, or for the most part, as though governing citizens is like running an enterprise efficiently. Whatever crime failing to, in certain circumstances, to do what is possible to ameliorate the effect of climate change might be, it'll be clearly in the future something that involves the international community. Because insofar as it's an offence against the community, it's not just the community of this particular nation, Australia or wherever it might be, but against humankind, constituted as a community by its falling under and consenting to fall under international law. And at some time, that might come seriously to be regarded as something like a crime against humanity, a crime against the conditions of the community of nations. And indeed, one might think of a crime against humanity as an act which requires the citizens of all nations to urge for its criminalisation and prosecution under international law, and that to be a condition of there being anything that can seriously be called a community of nations. But the difficulty, and this is the pessimistic note on which I'm afraid I end, the difficulty here is that the consequences of climate change can't be captured as offences against any particular kind. Can't only be captured as offences only against a particular kind of political and legal constituency, even if that constituency is the community of nations. It transcends all those categories. And that's why it can be such an explosive and dangerous notion. Why it can tempt us, drag us into terribly dangerous forms of political response. Thank you.